Hello and welcome to this NET English poetry talk-through for the AQA Power and Conflict Anthology. And today I'm going to be walking through the context and the content for Exposure. Now we'll start with a reading of the poem. So, Exposure. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn, massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes, with fingering stealth, come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare, snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath we lie out here. Therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels and shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. Wilfred Owen, who lived from 1893 to 1918, is probably the best known and the most respected poet of the First World War. He enjoyed a reasonably comfortable lower middle class upbringing, moving around different areas of Shropshire and Cheshire as the family followed his father's job as a station master, although Owen was particularly close to his mother. Now the family were religiously devout, and Owen was brought up as an evangelical Anglican, something that had a lasting impact on his beliefs and on the content of his writing. That said, while his faith appears to have been consistent, Owen would come to question the church as an organisation. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Owen was working as a private tutor in France. He returned to England and he enlisted in October 1915 before being commissioned as a second lieutenant and seeing active military service in France. Now, Owen's military service saw him undergoing a number of traumatic events. He suffered concussion after landing in a shell hole, for example, and then he was caught later in a trench mortar explosion and spent days unconscious, trapped among the remains of his fellow soldiers, which obviously and unsurprisingly traumatized him. Experiencing shell shock, which was the cumulative impact of his experiences, what we'd now call PTSD, Owen was, in June 1917, sent to a place called Craig Lockhart Hospital in Edinburgh to recuperate, and it was there that he met Siegfried Sassoon. Now, Siegfried Sassoon was already an established and, from some perspectives, notorious poet. He was heroic in battle, but he vehemently opposed the way the war was being conducted. Now, Wilfred Owen had written poems since childhood. He was influenced in particular by the work of people like Wordsworth and Shelley. But Owen had, to that point, almost entirely avoided writing about war as a subject. Now, Sassoon was to change that. Under Sassoon's guidance, Owen began writing about the experiences of the soldiers, both as a means to make the views and voices of the soldiers heard, but also, it seems, as almost like a kind of therapy for himself. As a result, his style seems to merge and meld influences from the Romantics in terms of the lyricism, the heroic scale, the interrelation between nature and humanity, and also from his mentor Sassoon. And that's where some things like, a satirical edge, the brutal realism, the unflinching sense of purpose, it's where those come from. Now, despite being offered the chance to remain in England, Owen returned to the front line in 1918. Sassoon had been injured and sent back to England, and Owen seems to have believed it to be his duty to continue to record and present the horrors of the war through his writing. Owen was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery during this time, but he was then killed in action on the 4th of November 1918, literally a week before the final armistice. At the time of his death, Owen had only published 5 poems, and Exposure wasn't one of them, although Owen was also working on a collection of his poems at the time of his death. It's worth beginning with the title. Now, exposure can be interpreted several ways, and each of them is relevant. Firstly, it can refer to being exposed to the weather, to the elements, and exposure remains in current usage when recording a death. Secondly, it can be about exposing something, particularly in the sense of a hidden truth or a reality. Both meanings apply, I think, in terms of the poem. Owen is exposing the suffering of the soldiers, but he's also describing the brutality of the weather, where many soldiers are indeed dying from or suffering from exposure. The poem begins with the soldiers out in the cold and out in the nighttime. From the beginning, the perspective of the soldiers is collective. Our brains ache that nigh us, we keep awake. Throughout the poem, the soldiers are anonymous and they're defined as a group. From a military perspective, remember, the idea is that individuals don't matter. It also lends itself, from a reader's perspective, to these soldiers representing the experience of any and all soldiers, something that wouldn't work were they made into individual people. The reference to the soldiers' brains aching suggests both mental and physical pain, caused, it seems, by the merciless iced east winds that knive us. The personification of the weather here and throughout the poem is important. It's not simply hurting them, but deliberately, consciously attacking them. And there's a clear irony that the soldiers in the war are being attacked by, are being hurt by, the personified weather, rather than by enemy soldiers who are almost entirely absent in the poem. It's also worth noting that from the very beginning of the poem, Owen is using sound features to create almost a kind of a soundscape for his readers, with the sibilance in merciless iced east winds, reflecting the hissing sound of the wind. The lines are noticeably longer than the 8 to 10 syllables you'd normally expect in poetry of this kind, and it feels like Owen wants us to experience the long, drawn out, the dragging boredom of the soldiers. The soldiers in this first stanza remain awake because the night is silent. And the idea here is that the relentless emptiness and the absence means that the pressure is constant, it's unavoidable, it's inescapable. The sound focus continues with the alliterated W in wearied, we keep awake, and the assonance also in low, drooping. Both also arguably continue the onomatopoeically appropriate sounds of the wind. There's also a continuing sense of the disconcerting and disorientating environment in which the soldiers find themselves. Their memory of the salient, and that's the land between the trenches, is confused by the flares, and there's a small lights being fired up into the sky that reveal a glimpse of the landscape as they then descend. The sibilance of the wind merges with a nervous, again onomatopoeic, whispering of the centuries before the final line of this stanza, but nothing happens. And that final half line, but nothing happens, occurs at the end of 4 of the stanzas in the poem, including both the first and the last. And Owen's intention seems to be to suggest that despite all the suffering, despite everything they're enduring, nothing changes, nothing is achieved. There's the occasional interpretation offered that nothing happens could suggest the inevitability of death, that nothing is the thing that is happening. There is some validity to this, but it's more tenuous than the first interpretation. The mismatch between the constant need for focus and the monotony of the inactivity continues in the second stanza as the soldiers watch in readiness, listening to the mad gusts tugging on the wire. Again, there's the visualizing of the weather through the lens of the war and its impact on the men, like the twitching agonies of men among its brambles. The war is distant, northward, far off, and it's also unceasing, incessantly. But it has no impact. It feels unreal, like a dull rumour. And the soldiers are left with the same question as the reader. What is the point? What are we doing here? Their purpose is unclear, and what they are achieving is unclear. The rhetorical question is, it seems, unanswerable. The poem tracks through from the night to the day as dawn begins to grow. The oxymoronic description of dawn as having a poignant misery is worth unpacking a bit. Dawn is associated with new beginnings, with light, with hope, usually. But here, the light simply reveals more of the same, the rain, the clouds. For the soldiers, their entire existence seems focused around the triplet. War lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. In a sense, the external, broader aspects, the war, seem less relevant than the immediacy of the weather, rain soaks, and the foreboding sense of menace. Dawn is personified as an enemy general, massing in the east a melancholy army that attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. Literally, these are clouds approaching in sequence, relentless and continuous. Once more strongly suggests, of course, that this is a repeated, repetitive occurrence. But again, the ironic military image is used, with the added resonance that the uniform worn by the majority of German troops on the battlefield was grey. And there's useful ambiguity around shivering, as to whether the clouds are causing shivering, or whether it's the enemy troops that are in the same situation. Once again, we're given the contrast between the popular image of war fed to the public, of heroic combat, and the reality, boredom, inactivity, relentless pressure, exposure to the weather. And what's achieved by this? Nothing, because nothing happens. There's a sudden shift in the fourth stanza, in which successive flights of bullets streak the silence. The sibilance here seems now to link to the sound of bullets hissing through the snowy air, with the additional meaning attached to the sound, adding to that disconcerting, discombobulating feeling of the soldiers. However, the bullets are anonymous. Nothing is referenced as having fired those bullets, and they are also, as the poem notes, less deadly than the snow. Once again, the weather is having far more impact. It's far more of an enemy than the enemy soldiers are. What's noticeable is the sense of nonchalance around the bullets. The soldiers seem to view them as unremarkable, as an irrelevance. In contrast, the air shudders black with snow. Now, black as a colour seems like an odd choice, since snow is, in theory, white. Now, maybe there's a link to the idea of ash or mud, but the more logical meaning, I think, is that the snow is firstly blocking out the light, metaphorically as well as literally, and secondly also that it prevents them seeing anything. Much like the clouds, the flowing flakes seem to flock, pause, and renew. There's a sense of relentless repetition again here, with the alliteration of the F adding another sound to that auditory palette with which Owen is painting. The men watch them wandering, suggesting almost a sense of boredom, but also the continuing focus on the men as passive observers of the causes of their suffering. They keep awake, they watch, they hear, they watch. And still the weather seems uncaring. The wind is nonchalant, it's unsympathetic, but nothing happens. The snow is also the focus of the fifth stanza. Here, the pale flakes are compared to enemy soldiers creeping up on them with fingering stealth, juxtaposing the sudden shock of the bullets in the previous stanza, and also continuing the alliterated F sound. The men in response are reduced to an almost animal level, forced to cringe in holes, with that verb contrasting sharply with, again, that public image of the heroic warrior. Obviously, the holes are literally either dugouts or the cubbyholes they would carve out of the mud walls of the trench. There's a mismatch between the physical reality of the soldiers, freezing to death in a trench, and their mental or imaginative landscape. They are back on forgotten dreams, ambiguous whether they are returning to those dreams or whether the forgotten dreams are behind them. They're staring snow-dazed deep into grassier ditches. The men are blinded by snow, essentially suffering from sensory deprivation to the point that they're dreaming or hallucinating. The ditches are an image of home, with Gracia making the comparison between the natural fertility of their memories and the sterile world of snow that surrounds them. Mentally, they're surrounded by sun, in a world littered with blossoms, where the blackbird fusses. The memory of home is, notice, a memory not just of fertility and of life, but of warmth, of peace, of rest. The verb drowse, however, suggests that they're falling asleep. But there's an unavoidable association between drowse and dying, with the readers essentially asking the same question as the soldiers. Is it that we are dying? It's also noticeable that the question doesn't seem associated with fear, with concern, or even with excitement. There is instead almost a nonchalance, a relaxed curiosity. The ambiguity about whether the men are dying or simply hallucinating is reinforced by that comment that our ghosts drag home. Now, home is again a place of warmth. They are glimpsing the sunk fires, and those fires are glozed with crusted dark red jewels. The use of the image of gems to describe the fire shows the value attached to the heat for these men trapped as they are in the freezing weather, with the verb glozed blending glazed, as in glistening and gleaming, with glowing. The focus on sensory details is continued. We've had the glimpsing of the fires, which is warmth. Now we have the jingle of the crickets and the reference to the mice, the fact that they rejoice that the house is theirs. That serves as a reminder that these homes are empty because the men are serving in the war. The shutters and doors are literally closed, but the doors are closed for the soldiers in a metaphorical sense. They can't return home physically because it would mean abandoning their duty, but also because they and the world have changed enough. The men can never return to the England they left. Neither are the same. And with that realization, the men turn back to our dying. In the penultimate stanza, Owen builds from the memory of home to what home symbolizes, the men's reason for fighting. They believe not otherwise can kind fires burn. Without their service, there could be no kind fires. And the fires here represent home, warmth, hope, life, perhaps even faith. On a larger scale, we shift from the fires to the sun. Without their sacrifice, personified sons cannot smile true on child or field or fruit. And again, the nouns in that triplet are part of a semantic field of life and growth and fertility. The image then scales again from the fires to the sun to what the sun is often used to represent, God. As Owen notes, for God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Ultimately, the men are fighting not simply for home and warmth and life, but for God, the ultimate source of those things. And it's for these reasons that the men don't feel loath having to lie out here. Awful though it is, they don't detest it because they recognize the necessity of it. More than this, Owen acknowledges that this was why they were born, because love of God seems dying. In the final stanza, Owen returns to the immediate present. We shift from the enormity of the concepts in the previous stanza to the basic immediacy and the reality of the frost and the mud. The frost, we're told, will fasten on this mud and us, with the weather not differentiating between the mud and the men, suggesting that they are seen as one and the same, and also reduced by the weather, shrivelling, puckering. But it's also implying that the men are returning to the earth. It's almost like an echo of the funeral ceremony. The final image of the poem is of the burying party, and that's the soldiers with the responsibility for burying the dead. Their picks and shovels are held in a shaking grasp, with the interpretation open as to whether their hands are shaking due to the cold, or to their mental and emotional state. They pause over half-known faces, And again, there's an ambiguity as to whether these faces are half known because they're only half familiar. There was, after all, a very high turnover and high mortality rate among frontline troops. Or are they half known because the faces have been damaged? The same ambiguity applies to the line, all their eyes are ice. Now, is this that the eyes of the burying party are ice because they've been left emotionally scarred, empty, inured by their experiences? Or does it refer instead to the eyes of the dead bodies that are literally ice in the sense of the fluids being frozen? Ultimately, however, after all of this, after all the time and the trauma and the suffering and the sensory deprivation and the dreams and the damage, after all of that, nothing happens. So in terms of poems within the AQA Anthology, which would provide useful comparisons or contrasts, there are a lot for this one. We've obviously got the tension between people and the power of the weather, and that can be usefully linked to poems such as Storm on the Island or The Prelude. However, there's also the link to the grouped experiences of the soldiers in poems such as The Charge of the Light Brigade or Bayonet Charge. We've got the tensions between life and death and between choice and sacrifice. And we see that also explored in poems such as Kamikaze, Remains, War Photographer. But there's also the idea of conflict and home that we can see quite usefully in The Emigre. Thank you very much for listening, and please don't forget that there is a huge range of videos covering all the Power and Conflict poems and all the other English GCSE topics on the Net English YouTube channel, which is, as ever, www.youtube.com/netenglish1.